The box that changed everything. The December wind howled through the narrow alley, weaving between brick buildings and rusted fire escapes like a restless ghost. Snowflakes clung to every surface, turning patches of dirt and discarded trash into a brittle mosaic of ice and slush. On the edge of the alley, a boy sat curled behind a rusted dumpster, his knees drawn to his chest, his thin jacket pulled tight around his skeletal frame. 12-year-old Ethan Reese had long since stopped feeling the full sting of cold. Hunger, exhaustion, and the gnawing ache of loneliness had dulled his senses over the years. The edges of his mind felt fuzzy, worn down from too many nights spent on unforgiving concrete and too many days scraping for meals in garbage bins. His fingers, raw and red from the cold, worked at a loose thread on his sleeve, tugging until the fabric unraveled further. The world moved on around him. Distant honks, the rumble of delivery trucks, the occasional bark of a stray dog, all sounds of a city that had no use for boys like him. People passed by the alley, bundled in warm coats, clutching steaming cups of coffee. No one looked his way. No one ever did. Invisible kids didn't warrant attention. They were part of the background, like the graffiti on brick walls or the overflowing trash cans. Ethan's stomach twisted painfully, a sharp reminder that it had been 2 days since his last meal. Half a discarded sandwich salvaged from behind a deli. He pressed his forehead to his knees, trying to will the hunger away. One more night. Just get through one more night, he told himself, the mantra he had whispered for years. It was the same promise that had carried him from one shelter to the next, through foster homes that never felt like home, and finally, to the streets. Then, through the cold silence, a sound broke through. So faint Ethan thought at first it was a trick of his mind. The thin, reedy cry, barely louder than the wind. His body tensed, every survival instinct honed by years of life on the street flaring to life. Noise meant trouble. Noise could mean someone was coming. Someone dangerous. He held his breath, listening. There it was again. Softer, weaker, but unmistakably there. A baby's cry. Ethan's first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever it wasn't his problem. That was rule number 1 of street survival. Don't get involved. Getting involved meant questions. Questions led to cops, and cops led to foster care. And foster care was just another word for disappointment. But the sound tugged at something deep inside him, something he had thought was long dead. The memory of soft hands tucking him into bed when he was small, of lullabies sung off-key, of warmth and safety that had been gone for so long it felt like someone else's memory. Cursing under his breath, Ethan pushed to his feet, his knees stiff from the cold. His sneakers, 2 sizes too big and patched with duct tape, scraped over the pavement as he followed the sound deeper into the alley. The cry led him to a pile of trash, newspapers soaked and frozen into stiff sheets, plastic bags torn open, and spilling their secrets across the ground. Ethan hesitated. There was no telling what might be under there. A dead animal, a drunk passed out, something worse. But the cry came again, weaker now, and his chest tightened at the sound. With trembling hands, he peeled back layers of garbage, the stink making his eyes water. Beneath a damp blanket of newspapers lay a cardboard shoebox, battered and damp from the snow. The sound was coming from inside. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the lid, every instinct screaming at him to walk away. Whatever was inside, it wasn't his problem. Except, it was. Because no one else was going to come looking. No one else cared. He lifted the lid. The breath whooshed from his lungs like a punch to the gut. Inside, nestled in a torn piece of an old sweatshirt, lay a newborn baby. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, her fists trembling weakly. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her mouth opening in a silent cry too weak to make it past the howling wind. Ethan's mind went blank. He knew nothing about babies. He could barely take care of himself. But there was no time to think. The baby's shallow breaths were growing fainter, her body losing heat with every second. Panic surged up, a cold flood in his chest. He pulled off his hoodie, wrapping it around the tiny body, tucking her against his chest. Her skin was icy, the faintest hint of warmth left in her small form. He could feel the flutter of her heartbeat, fragile as a moth's wing. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere with grown-ups who knew what to do. Street Agnes Hospital was 4 blocks away. Ethan had passed it 1,000 times, always keeping his distance. Hospitals meant questions. Questions meant foster care, or worse, juvie. But the baby's life was slipping through his fingers, and there was no time to think about himself. Clutching the shoebox in one hand, the baby bundled against his chest with the other, Ethan ran. The icy air cut into his lungs like knives, every breath a struggle. His legs burned with exhaustion, but fear drove him faster. Snowflakes pelted his face, melting against his skin. His worn sneakers skidded on patches of ice, sending him sprawling more than once. But he got up, each time, the baby's fragile life the only thing that mattered. He stumbled into the emergency room, the automatic doors sliding open with a hiss. Warm air enveloped him, but it did nothing to stop the trembling in his limbs. Heads turned. A nurse behind the reception desk dropped her clipboard. "Help." Ethan's voice cracked with panic. "Please, someone. She's not breathing right." The nurse was already moving, her shoes squeaking against the polished floor as she reached him. "What?" Her eyes widened as she saw the tiny bundle in his arms. "Oh God." With practiced hands, she lifted the baby, her expression shifting from shock to professional urgency. "Get Dr. Patel," she shouted to someone behind her. "We've got a hypothermic newborn." More people appeared, moving in a blur. The baby was swept away, Ethan left standing empty-handed and hollow-chested in the middle of the ER, shivering not from the cold, but from the sudden absence in his arms. "Where did you find her?" a voice asked. Ethan turned, finding himself face to face with a man in a white coat. The doctor, probably. His voice was kind, but there was steel beneath it, the kind of voice that expected answers. "In the alley," Ethan said, his voice small, "behind Mason Street." The doctor's expression darkened. "How long was she there?" I don't know." His knees buckled, and the nurse caught him just before he hit the floor. "You're freezing," she said gently. "Come on, let's get you warmed up." Ethan let her lead him to a chair, the warmth of the hospital seeping into his bones as his body finally registered how cold he was. He stared at his hands, still curled like they were holding the baby, the emptiness terrifying. Somewhere down the hall, he heard the beep of machines, the urgent voices of doctors and nurses working to save a life so tiny, so fragile it seemed impossible she could survive. But she was fighting. He could feel it, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he couldn't name, something close to hope. As the machines beeped and the storm howled outside, a new storm was brewing inside him. A storm of questions. Who had left the baby there? Why? And what would happen to her now? Ethan had no answers, only the growing certainty that he wasn't going anywhere, not until he knew that the baby, the little girl who had been abandoned like trash, was going to be okay. A place between fear and hope. The warmth inside Street Agnes Hospital felt too heavy, pressing against Ethan's skin like a layer of damp wool. After days, weeks, maybe even months, exposed to nothing but the sharp teeth of winter, the sudden blast of heat made him nauseous. His limbs tingled painfully as sensation returned, pins and needles crawling up his fingers and toes. But the discomfort was easy to ignore compared to the weight sitting in the center of his chest, the empty space where the baby had been. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd held her, how much of himself had curled around her fragile body, trying to shield her from the brutal world they both came from. His hoodie still carried the ghost of her warmth, though it was quickly fading. A nurse guided him to a plastic chair, the kind designed to be uncomfortable enough that no one would linger too long. His legs gave out before he even sat properly, his body slumping forward, elbows on knees, hands trembling between them. The nurse knelt in front of him, her soft hand settling on his bony wrist. "Hey," she said, her voice low enough not to startle him. "We need to know a few things, okay? Where you found her, how long she was outside, anything you remember." Ethan didn't answer right away. His mind was still stuck back in that alley. The stink of rot and grease, the crunch of ice beneath his sneakers, the soft, broken sound of the baby's cry. It was quieter than even the stray cats that picked through garbage at night, but somehow it had reached him through all the noise of survival. I don't know how long," he finally muttered, his voice raspy from cold and disuse. "She was just there, in a shoebox." The nurse's hand tensed slightly, but her expression remained calm. "You did the right thing bringing her here. Is she?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat raw. "Is she gonna make it?" The nurse didn't answer right away, and the silence felt heavier than all the snow piled in the alley. "The doctors are doing everything they can," she said finally. "But she's very cold and very small." Ethan nodded stiffly. He knew how that worked. When you were too small, too weak, the world had a way of swallowing you whole. He was still here only because he learned to make himself invisible. But that tiny life in his arms had made it impossible to disappear. A loud voice down the hall broke through his thoughts. A doctor, maybe, calling out orders in clipped, urgent tones. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the urgency made his stomach flip. "I need to see her," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out without thought. The nurse blinked. "Sweetheart, they're working on her right now." "I need to see her." His voice cracked, but there was a stubborn edge underneath, one he hadn't known he still possessed. "I found her. I brought her here." The nurse hesitated, exchanging a glance with someone behind the desk, an older woman with tired eyes and a face that looked carved out of years of worry. After a moment, the older woman gave a small nod. "Come on," the nurse said gently. "Just for a minute." Ethan followed her down the hall, his shoes squeaking wetly with each step. He felt like an intruder, a smear of dirt in a place that was too clean, too bright. The fluorescent lights made his skin look sickly and pale, and the heat made the cold sweat on his neck feel greasy. They stopped in front of a large window, and the nurse pointed. There, in a small, clear plastic bassinet lay the baby. Her skin was no longer the frightening shade of blue it had been when Ethan found her, but it was still pale, almost translucent, her tiny chest rising and falling so shallowly it made his own breath catch. Wires snaked around her, monitors beeping steadily, though too slowly for his liking. A small nasal cannula fed oxygen into her nose, her lips slightly parted as she fought for every breath. "She's so small," Ethan whispered. The nurse's voice softened. "She's a fighter. So are you." He wasn't sure about that. He didn't feel like a fighter. Fighters had plans, weapons, strategies. He just had instincts. Run, hide, survive. But looking at her, so fragile and alone, something shifted inside him. Maybe survival was fighting, in its own way. "Do you know who she is?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "We don't," the nurse said, and her expression flickered with something. Sadness, frustration, maybe both. "No note, no identifying information. We've already contacted the authorities. They'll come ask you questions." Ethan's stomach dropped. Authorities. That word always carried weight. And consequences. Questions meant attention. Attention meant trouble. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "I'm not going back." The nurse's brow furrowed. "Back where?" "Nowhere," Ethan said quickly, but the panic in his voice betrayed him. She didn't press. Maybe she saw the way his whole body tensed, the way his eyes flicked toward the nearest exit like a cornered animal calculating his escape. "Let's get you warmed up," she said instead. "I'll find you something to eat." Ethan followed her reluctantly to a small break room. She handed him a styrofoam cup of cocoa, the warmth seeping into his fingers even through the thin foam. It tasted too sweet, too rich, but he drank it anyway, his stomach too empty to be picky. The nurse left him alone, and for a moment, the silence felt heavier than it had in the alley. His whole body ached, not just from cold and hunger, but from something deeper, something he didn't know how to name. He wasn't used to caring. Surviving, yes. Enduring, sure. But caring, really caring, that was dangerous. Caring was a weakness that could get you killed. But there she was, fighting for every breath, and Ethan knew he couldn't walk away. He had to know where she came from. He had to know who had left her there, and why. The first police officer showed up within an hour. A woman with dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense ponytail and eyes that had seen too much. She had a notepad and a voice too soft to match her badge. "You're the one who found her?" she asked, crouching down to eye level. Ethan nodded. "Can you tell me your name?" He hesitated. Names were dangerous too. But something about the baby, about the fragile line between life and death she walked, made him want to try, even if it hurt. "Ethan. Last name?" He shook his head. "Just Ethan." The officer's mouth tightened, but she didn't push. "Okay, Ethan. Can you tell me where you found her?" He described the alley, the boxes, the sound that had drawn him. The officer took careful notes, occasionally glancing at him, as if trying to decide what to make of this ragged kid who had shown up with a half-frozen baby. "Did you see anyone else around?" she asked. "No," he lied automatically, the old reflex kicking in. The truth, that the alley always felt full of eyes, even when it looked empty, was too hard to explain. The officer stood. "We'll need to talk again." Ethan's stomach nodded. "Am I in trouble?" "No," she said, but her voice carried the same false reassurance he'd heard too many times before. "You did a good thing." It didn't feel like it. It felt like the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand, every step dragging him deeper into something he didn't understand. But when the officer left, Ethan found his way back to the window. The baby was still there, still fighting. "I got you here," he whispered, pressing his palm against the cold glass. "I'm not leaving you now." He didn't know what came next. Not for her, and definitely not for himself. But for the first time in a long time, he had a reason to stay. And that was something. The baby with no name. The hospital cafeteria was eerily quiet at dawn. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their cold glow washing everything in pale yellow. Ethan sat at a table in the corner, his back to the wall, eyes locked on the exit. Old habits died hard, even inside this clean, warm place where no one had tried to hurt him. Yet, he couldn't stop scanning for escape routes. In front of him sat a tray with a stale bagel and a paper cup of orange juice. He hadn't touched either. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it was the wrong kind of hunger, too deep, too tangled with nerves and fear to be solved with food. Somewhere down the hall, machines beeped steadily, each pulse marking another second that the baby was still alive. The baby. She didn't have a name. No one knew who she was, where she came from, or who had left her in that frozen alley to die. That thought alone made Ethan's stomach churn harder than hunger ever had. Even out here, kids like him had names, the names they were born with, the names they gave themselves when they stopped trusting adults with the truth. Names were survival. But she had nothing. Just him. A soft creak of a shoe on tile snapped Ethan's attention to the doorway. A nurse stood there, not the one from before. This woman was older, her face lined with worry and long shifts. Her eyes found him immediately, not because she knew him, but because kids like Ethan stood out, even in a place that had seen everything. "They're asking for you," she said softly, her voice gentle but laced with authority. "The officers." Ethan's gut twisted. The cops again. He knew it was coming. He hadn't exactly expected to disappear into the background after showing up with a half-frozen infant, but the reality of it made his chest tight. He stood, shoving his hands deep into the pockets of his too-thin hoodie, and followed her down the corridor. His sneakers squeaked with every step, a sound so loud it made him feel like he was announcing himself to the whole hospital. They led him into a small room off the main hallway. Not an office, not a patient room, just a generic space with scuffed linoleum floors and a table too clean for comfort. Two people were waiting, Detective Rains and Officer Cho, their badges glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. Rains was tall and weathered, the kind of man who had probably seen too much and carried it in the set of his shoulders. Cho was younger, her hair pulled into a tight braid, her expression less harsh but no less serious. "Ethan," Rains said, motioning to the chair across from them. "Come sit down." Ethan hesitated, the urge to run tugging at the back of his mind. But he sat, his fingers curled around the edge of the chair, knuckles white, like gripping something solid would keep him from spinning apart. "We just want to talk," Cho added, her voice softer than her partner's. "You're not in trouble." That was what they always said, until you were. Ethan said nothing. "We're trying to figure out where the baby came from," Rains continued. "You're the only person who knows anything about her. Anything you tell us could help." Ethan shifted, the plastic chair creaking under him. His instinct was to say nothing, to make himself small, to vanish like smoke before they could pin him down. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was that tiny, trembling hand curling weakly against his chest. She was counting on him. "There was no one there," Ethan said finally, voice low. "I didn't see who left her." "Did you hear anything before you found her?" Cho asked. Voices, footsteps, a car driving away. Ethan shook his head. Just her crying. The detectives exchanged a glance. Subtle, but Ethan caught it. They knew something. Something they weren't telling him. "What?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "What aren't you saying?" Rains leaned back slightly, sizing Ethan up. "There was a security camera on the corner of Mason and 3rd. It doesn't cover the alley, but it caught a car pulling up around 2:30 in the morning. Black sedan, tinted windows. It idled for a few minutes, then drove off." Ethan's stomach knotted. So someone just dropped her and left. "Looks that way," Cho said grimly. "But there's more." Rains slid a small plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside was a tiny gold bracelet, delicate and impossibly small, like it belonged to a doll. This was found tangled in the baby's blanket. Ethan's breath caught. The bracelet was engraved, not with a name, but with a symbol, a small star inside a circle. Something about it tickled the edges of Ethan's memory, like a shadow just out of reach. "Do you recognize it?" Cho asked. He shook his head, but the unease in his gut grew sharper. "No. We're running it through databases," Rains said. "See if it matches anything. Missing persons reports, hospital records, family crests. But so far, nothing." "Nothing," Ethan echoed. Rains folded his hands on the table. That baby wasn't just abandoned. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure there were no clues about who she is. No fingerprints on the box, no fibers or prints on the blanket. It's like they wanted her to disappear. The air felt too thick to breathe. Ethan had been left behind before, by his mom, by foster parents, by social workers who promised things would get better. But this was different. This was deliberate. Why would someone do that? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rains didn't answer. Maybe because there was no answer that made sense. "We need you to stay close," Cho said. "Just in case." "In case what?" Ethan asked, his gut tightening again. "In case they come back," Rains said. Ethan's heart skipped. "Come back." "For her." "For her," Rains said quietly. "Or for you." The floor seemed to tilt under Ethan's feet. For him. What did he have to do with anything? He was just some kid who happened to be there. The detectives let him go after that, though their eyes followed him all the way down the hall. The nurse waited outside, her expression carefully neutral. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know. He found his way back to the nursery window, pressing his hands against the glass. The baby lay there, tiny and fragile, her small fingers twitching in sleep. The bracelet with the star and circle lay beside her now, cleaned and gleaming under the hospital lights. "Who are you?" Ethan whispered. The baby didn't answer, but something in her tiny, steady breaths seemed to whisper back. "We don't know yet." The hair on the back of his neck prickled, a cold sensation that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. For the first time, Ethan realized something terrifying. Someone had left her there, and someone else might want her back. And now, because he had found her, because he had refused to walk away, they might want him too. Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the window. Too thin, too pale, eyes too old for 12. Behind him, the hallway stretched empty and silent. But it didn't feel empty. It felt watched. The baby's breath fogged the inside of the incubator, her chest rising and falling with tiny, determined effort. Ethan knew that fight. He'd been fighting the same way his whole life. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered, voice cracking with something he couldn't name. Not now. He didn't know who they were, not yet. But if they wanted the baby, they were going to have to come through him first, and Ethan had nothing left to lose. Whispers in the shadows. The sterile hum of the hospital was a poor shield against the weight pressing down on Ethan's chest. The baby's slow, labored breaths had taken up permanent residence in his mind, playing over and over like a broken tape. Every beep of the machines in the NICU, every rustle of a nurse's footsteps, was a reminder that she was clinging to life, and that someone had meant for her not to. The gold bracelet with the star inside a circle rested in a clear evidence bag on the nurse's desk. Even from across the hall, Ethan couldn't stop staring at it. That little piece of metal felt heavier than a brick. It was the only clue anyone had, and it was barely a clue at all. He'd seen symbols before. Gangs tagged the alleys with marks to show their territory. Kids in shelters carved secret signs into bunk beds to leave warnings or messages for the next arrival. Symbols were like words. They told stories, if you knew how to read them. But Ethan didn't know this story, and something about that made his skin itch. He paced the hallway outside the NICU, the hospital-issued socks slipping against the polished floor. They'd taken his soaked sneakers and ragged hoodie, leaving him in a set of two big hospital scrubs. It felt wrong. Too clean, too soft. Like someone else's skin. He didn't belong here. But neither did the baby. The thought made his stomach twist. They were both outsiders here. Two pieces of street trash, accidentally dropped into a world of clean sheets and soft voices. And the only reason either of them were here was because of him. He didn't know if that made him her savior or her curse. The thought was still rattling around his head when the elevator doors slid open at the far end of the hall. A man stepped out, tall, with a heavy coat too expensive for someone visiting a public hospital. His shoes barely made a sound, and his hair was slicked back, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Something about him set Ethan's instincts screaming before the man even made it halfway down the hall. He walked like a predator. Ethan shrank back against the wall, trying to disappear into the corner. He knew that kind of man, the kind who didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to, the kind who could hurt you without laying a hand on you. The man paused by the nurse's desk, his back to Ethan. "I'm here to inquire about the abandoned baby," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs so hard it hurt. "I'm sorry, who are you?" the nurse asked, her polite tone dipping into suspicion. "I'm with Child Welfare Services," the man said smoothly, flashing something at the nurse too quickly for Ethan to see. "We're handling placement." The nurse hesitated. "I wasn't told anyone would be coming tonight." "It was a last-minute assignment," the man said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm sure you understand." Ethan's nails dug into his palms. Everything about this was wrong. The nurse reached for her phone, but the man's smile grew sharper. "I'd rather not disturb the doctors," he said. "Just point me to the infant, and I'll do the rest." The nurse hesitated, but only for a second. She gestured toward the NICU. Ethan could see the tiny bundle through the window, her chest rising and falling with those fragile breaths. The man followed the nurse's gesture with his eyes, and for a split second, Ethan saw something flicker across his face. Relief, but also satisfaction, like he'd found something that belonged to him. Ethan's stomach turned to ice. The man gave a polite nod, thanked the nurse, and turned down the hall, walking straight toward the NICU. Ethan didn't think. He bolted. He skidded into the NICU a half-second before the man reached the door. The nurses inside jumped at his sudden arrival, their eyes widening at the sight of the barefoot, skinny kid in oversized scrubs. "Don't let him in," Ethan blurted, his voice cracking with panic. "He's not with child welfare. He's lying." The man's face didn't change. If anything, his smile softened, like Ethan was a cute joke. "I'm just here to check on the infant," the man said, calm and unbothered. The nurses exchanged glances. One of them reached for the phone on the wall. "I'll just call security to verify." For the first time, the man's smooth expression flickered. "That won't be necessary," he said. But the nurse was already dialing. Ethan put himself between the man and the incubator, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His legs shook, but he didn't move. "She's not yours," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "You don't get to take her." The man took a step forward. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. His presence filled the room like oil seeping into cracks, thick, suffocating, and impossible to get rid of. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," the man said softly, his voice only for Ethan. "Walk away now, and this ends for you." Ethan's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "No." For the first time, the man's calm cracked. His jaw tightened, and for just a breath, Ethan saw the rage hiding underneath, controlled, but sharp enough to cut. Security arrived moments later, 2 uniformed guards with bored expressions that sharpened when they saw Ethan's wild eyes and the man's too polished stance. "Sir, we're going to need to see identification," one of the guards said. The man gave Ethan one last glance, a promise in his eyes, then smoothly produced a business card and ID. Whatever it said, the guard seemed satisfied. Ethan's heart dropped. But the man didn't press to enter the NICU. Instead, he tucked the ID away, gave Ethan a too polite smile, and said, "I'll be back." The guards escorted him out, and the tension didn't break until the elevator doors slid shut behind him. Ethan's knees gave out, and he sank onto the floor, his heart hammering so hard it hurt. A nurse knelt beside him. "Sweetheart, what's going on? Do you know that man?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but I know what people like him look like." His voice shook, but he forced the words out. "He's not here to help." The nurse hesitated, clearly torn between comforting him and calling someone with more authority. "You should tell the police." "They never listen," Ethan muttered, but he knew he had to try. An hour later, Detective Raines stood outside the NICU, his hands on his hips, his brow furrowed. Ethan sat in the corner, knees drawn to his chest, trying to stop shaking. "You're sure about this?" Raines asked. Ethan nodded. "I know what I saw." Raines let out a long breath. "We'll review the security footage, see if he shows up anywhere else." "Don't let him take her," Ethan said, his voice sharper than he meant. Raines' expression softened, just slightly. "We won't." But Ethan didn't trust promises. He'd been made too many before. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat beside the NICU window, watching the baby breathe, his heart thudding with every tiny rise and fall of her chest. Somewhere out there, someone wanted her gone. Someone powerful. Someone who didn't leave loose ends. And now Ethan was a loose end too. But that didn't matter. He leaned closer to the glass, his fingers pressing against the cool surface. "I got you this far," he whispered. I'm not leaving you now." The baby didn't stir, but her tiny hand curled slightly, as if reaching for something invisible. Ethan took it as a sign. They were in this together now, no matter what came next. The edge of vanishing. The hospital corridors were eerily quiet after midnight, the usual hustle and bustle reduced to the soft squeak of nurses' shoes and the hum of machines behind closed doors. The shadows here were different than the ones Ethan knew from the alleys. Sharper somehow, more clinical, but no less dangerous. He sat in a plastic chair just outside the NICU, knees drawn up to his chest, the two big hospital scrubs bunched around his ankles. He hadn't been able to sleep, not even for a few minutes. Every time his eyes drifted shut, he saw the man in the coat, the slick hair, the polished shoes, the way his smile never quite touched his eyes. There was something about him, something Ethan recognized even though he couldn't place where. Predators had a scent. They didn't smell like sweat or rot like the street drunks or alley creeps. They smelled clean, too clean. They moved with purpose, always scanning, always knowing exactly where the exits were. That man had the same cold, weightless presence Ethan had felt in dark corners too many times before. But this time, Ethan wasn't the prey. This time, they wanted the baby with no name. Ethan stood up and pressed his hands against the window, staring down at her tiny bundled form. Wires still snaked around her, the machines whispering secrets to the nurses every few seconds. She was so small, so impossibly small, like she didn't even belong in this world, just a guest, passing through. "You should get some sleep," came a voice from behind him. Ethan jumped, spinning around. Nurse Layla, the night nurse with the soft eyes, stood with her arms folded, a gentle smile tugging at her lips. "I'm fine," Ethan muttered, the automatic lie slipping out without thought. She didn't push. Maybe she saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way his fingers couldn't stop twitching at his sides. "You're worried about her." It wasn't a question. "She doesn't have anyone," Ethan said. "If I leave, she's got no one." "She has us," Layla said gently. "The doctors, the nurses, the social workers." "No." Ethan's voice was sharper than he meant. "That's not the same. They care because they're supposed to. I care because I found her, because she's mine." He didn't say it aloud, but the words hung between them anyway. Layla's expression softened, like she understood something she wasn't going to say out loud. "Come on," she said softly. "There's Coco in the break room." Ethan hesitated, eyes darting back to the baby. "She'll still be here when you come back," Layla promised. He followed her, if only because the cold knot in his stomach made him crave something warm. The break room was small, with dented cabinets and a coffee maker that looked older than Ethan. Layla poured cocoa into a paper cup, setting it in front of him before sitting down across the table. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, Ethan cradling the cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. He felt brittle, like if someone spoke too loud, he might crack in half. "You said you didn't see anyone when you found her," Layla said softly, not quite a question. Ethan nodded. "But you've seen someone since." His fingers clenched around the cup. "A man." She didn't flinch or look surprised, which told Ethan something even worse. She already knew. "The detectives told us they found someone on the security footage," Layla said quietly. "The man in the black coat." Ethan's stomach flipped. "You know who he is?" Layla shook her head. "No, but there was something off about him." "He wasn't from child welfare," Ethan said. "He was lying." "We know that now," Layla said, her voice tight with guilt. "But he had documents. Fake, but good ones. If you hadn't been here." He didn't want to think about it. If he hadn't stayed, if he hadn't been watching, that man would have walked right in and taken her. No one would have questioned it until it was too late. The baby would be gone. And Ethan was certain no one would have found her again. Or if they did, it would be in a place no one deserved to end up. Why her? Ethan asked. Why would someone go through all that trouble? Layla's silence was answer enough. She didn't know. Maybe they wanted to make her disappear, Ethan said softly, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Layla's expression flickered, but before she could answer, the door creaked open. Detective Rains stepped inside, his expression grim. We need to talk, he said. The conference room was too bright, too clean, and way too full of adults. Ethan sat in a chair at the far end of the table, his fingers wrapped around the edge like if he let go, the floor might drop out from beneath him. Across from him, Rains had spread out a series of photos, grainy security stills, close-ups of the shoebox, and a zoomed-in shot of the gold bracelet with the star inside a circle. This symbol, Rains tapped the photo of the bracelet. We found it in one other place. Ethan's mouth was dry. Where? Rains slid a second photo toward him. It was a missing person poster, yellowed at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from weather exposure. It showed a young woman, early 20s, dark hair, serious eyes, holding a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. The baby was wearing the same bracelet. This is Rebecca Mendez, Rains said. She disappeared from a maternity clinic 3 weeks ago. Ethan's stomach twisted. 3 weeks. She gave birth, and a day later, both she and the baby vanished, Rains said. No witnesses, no security footage inside the clinic. It's like they were erased. Ethan stared at the photo, his mind spinning. So the baby's hers. Almost definitely, Rains said. But there's no sign of Rebecca. And the man in the coat? Ethan asked. Is he connected to her? We don't know yet, Rains admitted. But we're working on it. Ethan's fingers dug into the edge of the table. None of this made sense. If the baby belonged to someone, why would they leave her in a freezing alley? And if someone took her from her mother, why dump her at all? None of it added up, unless the baby herself was the problem. What if? Ethan hesitated, the words heavy in his mouth. What if they were trying to hide her? From someone dangerous. Rains' expression darkened. That's a possibility. Ethan's heart pounded. Then she's not safe here. We've increased security, Rains said, but we can't relocate a newborn on a hunch. It's not a hunch, Ethan snapped. That man wasn't just looking for her. He knew exactly where she was. Rains stared at him, silent for a long moment. How do you know that? Because I know what it feels like when someone's hunting you, Ethan said softly. I've lived it. Rains' jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. That night, Ethan didn't sleep again. He sat by the NICU window, watching the baby breathe, the bracelet still sitting beside her. A symbol no one could explain. The halls were quieter than usual, too quiet. The sense of something coming, something dark, gnawed at Ethan's stomach. He'd lived too long with instincts sharpened by survival to ignore it. When the elevator dinged at 3 a.m., Ethan was already standing. He saw the shadow before he saw the man, the black coat, the gleam of his shoes. This time, there were no fake smiles, just cold eyes. Ethan's breath caught. They were here, and this time, they weren't leaving empty-handed. He didn't think. He ran. Straight for the NICU. Straight for the baby. He wasn't her family. He wasn't anyone. But he was the only one standing between her and the people who wanted her gone. And that was enough. A name for the nameless. The cold fingers of fear curled around Ethan's spine as the soft ding of the hospital elevator echoed through the silent hall. He knew before he even turned his head. The man in the coat was back. This time, the man didn't wear the polite mask of some fake social worker. His face was set in stone, the false smile gone. There was no need to pretend anymore. Ethan knew what the man wanted, and the man knew Ethan stood in his way. For the briefest second, their eyes locked. Ethan bolted. He didn't wait for the man to move. He spun on his heel, his socked feet slipping on the polished floor as he sprinted for the NICU door. His breath came fast and shallow, panic closing its fist around his lungs. There was only one thought pounding through his head. Get to her first. The baby. The nameless, fragile, barely breathing little girl whose life was a question mark, but whose fate had somehow become Ethan's responsibility. He didn't know why. He didn't need to. All he knew was that no one had ever fought for her before. No one but him. He slammed into the NICU doors, yanking them open so hard they bounced against the wall. The nurses on shift jumped, startled at the sudden noise. They're coming. Ethan's voice cracked with urgency. He's coming for her. Confusion flickered across their faces, but they didn't have time to ask questions. The sound of hard footsteps rang out behind Ethan, sharp and deliberate. One of the nurses reached for the phone on the wall, but Ethan knew there wasn't time. He darted past her, straight to the incubator. The baby lay there, impossibly small under the warming lights, her breath fogging the clear plastic. Her tiny hands twitched in sleep, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break. Ethan's hands shook as he reached into the incubator. He had no idea how to do this, how to unhook the wires or disconnect the machines without hurting her, but there wasn't time for careful. The man's reflection flickered in the glass. Too late. A hand grabbed Ethan's wrist. Strong, cold, unyielding. "Step away," the man said softly, but there was steel in his voice. "This doesn't concern you." Ethan twisted, yanking his arm free with all the strength his wiry body could muster. "She's not yours," he shouted, his voice raw and desperate. The man's lip curled. "Neither is she yours." "I don't care," Ethan spat. "She's got me." The man took a step closer, and Ethan could feel the cold radiating off him. "You don't know what you're protecting, boy." Ethan didn't back down. "I know enough." The man's hand darted forward, grabbing the front of Ethan's oversized hospital shirt, hauling him off his feet like he weighed nothing. For a heartbeat, Ethan dangled there, feet kicking uselessly. "Let him go," one of the nurses shouted, her voice thin with fear. The man ignored her, his eyes, pale and flat, locked on Ethan's. "You have no idea what she is," the man hissed. "Walk away. This is your last chance." Ethan's mind raced, terror screaming at him to run, to hide, to disappear the way he always had. But then his gaze flicked down to the baby, so small, so helpless, left in a freezing alley like trash, and still fighting. If she could fight, so could he. No. The man's grip tightened, but before he could do anything else, a sharp voice rang out. "Let him go. Now." The hallway was suddenly filled with the heavy stomp of boots and the unmistakable clatter of weapons being drawn. Detective Raines stood at the end of the hall, his gun raised, a squad of uniformed officers at his back. The red-faced hospital security guards trailed awkwardly behind, clearly caught off guard. The man's grip on Ethan loosened, just for a second, and Ethan took the opening. He twisted, kicking off the man's chest and falling to the floor in a tangle of limbs. "Step away from the child," Raines barked, his voice edged with the kind of authority that didn't leave room for negotiation. The man didn't move right away. His eyes flicked to the officers, then to the baby, then back to Ethan. For a single moment, Ethan saw something there. Not fear, not anger, but calculation. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but the man was outnumbered. Without a word, he turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking on the tile. No rush, no fear, just a promise. The elevator doors slid open, and the man stepped inside. The last thing Ethan saw before the doors closed was that cold, flat smile. The storm had passed, for now. Ethan didn't sleep. He couldn't. Raines sat with him for a while after, perched awkwardly on the edge of the plastic chair in the waiting room. They'd offered Ethan a bed in a quieter part of the hospital, but he'd refused. He wasn't leaving her. Who was he? Ethan asked after a long silence. "We don't know," Raines admitted. "No ID, no prints, nothing." Ethan hugged his knees to his chest. but he knew exactly where she was. Rains nodded grimly. That's the part that worries me. They sat in silence again, the only sound the distant beep of machines and the soft murmur of nurses' voices. Finally, Rains stood with a weary sigh. "Get some rest, kid," he said, clapping Ethan's shoulder lightly. "You did good." But Ethan couldn't rest. He stood at the window, watching her tiny chest rise and fall, the soft beat of her heart monitor the only proof that she was still fighting. They still didn't know her name. The sun was rising when Nurse Layla found him still standing there, his forehead pressed against the glass. The sky outside was streaked with pale pink and gold, the kind of sunrise you only noticed after a night you thought might kill you. "She's stronger than she looks," Layla said softly. Ethan swallowed hard. "She needs a name." Layla tilted her head. "Do you have one in mind?" He didn't, not right away. Names had always been something temporary to Ethan, something you could shed like old skin when the world got too dangerous. But this baby deserved better. He thought of the way she'd survived the cold, the way she fought for every breath, the way she held on, even when no one was there to hold her back. "Aurora," Ethan said finally. Layla smiled. "That's beautiful. Aurora means dawn, right?" Ethan asked, his voice softer now. "New beginning." Layla nodded. "It does." Ethan's reflection stared back at him in the window, thin, pale, worn down by too many hard nights. But there was something new in his eyes now, something he hadn't seen there before. Hope. "She's not gonna be alone," Ethan said quietly. "Not ever again." Layla rested a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Neither are you." He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe that this place, this too bright hospital with its 2 clean floors and 2 kind nurses, could be something more than temporary. Maybe it could be home. He didn't know what came next, for her or for him. But for the first time, he wanted to find out. Because now, they weren't just 2 forgotten souls in a broken city. They were Aurora and Ethan. They were family. And no one was going to take that away from them.